I knew something was wrong before I even stepped out of my car. My husband was standing on the front porch with a manila envelope in one hand, and my mother-in-law was beside him wearing the same smug little smile she used whenever she thought she had one. Brian didn't say hello. He held out the envelope and said, "The house is sold. You have nowhere to go." For a second I just stared at him. Then I smiled. His face tightened. "Why are you smiling?" I looked at the porch, the brass numbers beside the door, and the flower pot I had painted blue 3 summers earlier, because selling this house was the biggest mistake of your life. That morning, I had been in Aspen, sitting across from my grandmother's attorney in a quiet office above East Hopkins Avenue. Outside, tourists were carrying shopping bags and taking pictures beneath the yellow leaves. Inside, Michael Reeves adjusted his glasses and told me that Grandma Margaret had left me $7 million her estate outside Aspen and several investment accounts. I had actually laughed when he said the amount. Not because it was funny, because my mind couldn't hold it. Grandma had lived comfortably, but she never acted rich. She wore the same wool coat for 20 years, drove an old Subaru Outback, and saved rubber bands in a kitchen drawer. Michael slid a folder toward me. "There are additional documents you'll need to review," he said, "and one sealed letter. Your grandmother asked that you read it privately." I touched the envelope with her handwriting on the front. For Claire, I left Aspen just before noon, planning the entire drive home to Denver around how I would tell Brian. I stopped at a Safeway in Glenwood Springs and bought a bottle of champagne because it felt like the kind of news people celebrated with champagne. I even imagined his reaction. He would blink twice, ask me to repeat myself, then hug me in the kitchen. Maybe we would order dinner from the Italian place near Sloan's Lake, and talk about paying off the mortgage, helping our niece with college, and finally taking the trip to Maine we had postponed for 6 years. That was the marriage I believed I was driving home to. Instead, Brian's attorney stood near the porch railing, while Patricia watched me like she had bought tickets to a show. I opened the envelope. Divorce papers. Brian folded his arms. "I've already moved my things." "Where?" "My mother's condo for now." Patricia gave a small laugh. "He won't be there long." I looked at Brian. "You sold our house without telling me." "It was in both our names," he said quickly. "My lawyer handled it." The attorney cleared his throat, but said nothing. "How much?" "That's no longer your concern." That answer told me everything. Brian had expected anger tears, maybe begging. He had prepared himself for a scene. What he hadn't prepared for was silence. I set the champagne bottle on the hood of my car, and slipped Grandma's sealed letter into my purse. Then I asked one simple question. "Did the sale close today?" Brian smiled. "Yesterday morning." And that was when I knew he had no idea what he had done. I didn't answer Brian. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I suddenly realized I didn't know the man standing in front of me anymore. I picked up the bottle of champagne from the hood of my car. "I'll come back for my things," I said quietly. Patricia crossed her arms. "There's not much left to collect." Brian didn't stop her. That hurt more than anything she'd said. I climbed back into my SUV and drove away before either of them could see my hands shaking. Instead of heading toward a hotel, I drove aimlessly through Denver, past Sloan's Lake, past our favorite coffee shop on Tennyson Street, past the neighborhood where we'd bought our first house 18 years earlier. It all felt strangely familiar and completely foreign at the same time. I finally pulled into a parking lot overlooking Cherry Creek Reservoir, and turned off the engine. Only then did I let myself cry. Not loud, just quiet tears that seemed to come from somewhere much older than that afternoon. When I finally caught my breath, I thought back to how Brian and I had started. We met in Fort Collins when I was 29. I worked in the accounting department for a regional medical supplier. Brian had just earned his real estate license and carried himself with the confidence of someone convinced success was right around the corner. He wasn't flashy back then. He was funny, patient. He remembered little things like how I always ordered my burgers without onions or how I called my grandmother every Sunday evening no matter where I was. Grandma Margaret adored him, at least in the beginning. We married 2 years later in Estes Park. Nothing extravagant, just family, close friends, and a reception at a small lodge overlooking the mountains. For years, life felt ordinary in the best possible way. I built a stable career in financial compliance for a healthcare company in Denver. Brian chased bigger commissions in residential real estate. Some years were excellent, other years weren't. Whenever business slowed down, he'd reassure me. One big listing changes everything. Sometimes it did. Most of the time it didn't. That was when Patricia would appear. She always had opinions. Claire works too much. Claire isn't supportive enough. Claire doesn't understand ambitious men. I smiled through most of it. Looking back, I wasn't keeping the peace. I was avoiding conflict because I believed marriage required endless compromise. Grandma disagreed. About 8 years ago, we were sitting on the porch of her Aspen home watching snow fall over the mountains. She handed me a mug of hot chocolate and asked, "Do you know the difference between trust and ownership?" End up always. I laughed. I don't think that's a trick question. It isn't. She looked toward the trees before speaking again. People confuse marriage with ownership. Loving someone doesn't give them the right to control your future. At the time, I thought she was simply sharing another piece of grandmotherly wisdom. Now those words echoed inside my head. My phone buzzed. Brian. I ignored it. A minute later, another message. You should sign the papers tonight. It'll make things easier. I almost laughed. Easier for whom? Then another text arrived. This one from Patricia. You'll thank Brian someday. I deleted both messages without replying. Instead, I opened my purse and took out the folder Michael Reeves had given me in Aspen. For the first time since leaving his office, I carefully read every page. Near the bottom of one document, a sentence stopped me cold. Transfer of title recorded 6 months prior. I read it again, then a third time. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Brian had celebrated selling a house. What he didn't know was that months before Grandma passed away, the ownership had quietly changed. I reached for my phone. This time I wasn't calling my husband. I was calling Michael Reeves. As soon as he answered, I asked one question. Michael, does Brian have any idea what he's done? There was a long pause. No, he said calmly. And Claire, I strongly recommend you don't tell him. Michael asked if I could drive back to Aspen the next morning. There are some things I'd rather explain in person, he said. This isn't the kind of conversation we should have over the phone. I barely slept that night. A friend from work, Linda, insisted I stay in her guest room instead of wasting money on a hotel. She made grilled cheese sandwiches around 10 o'clock, poured us each a cup of chamomile tea, and never once asked me to explain why my marriage had fallen apart in a single afternoon. Sometimes kindness sounds like silence. I left Denver before sunrise and reached Aspen just after 10 o'clock. Michael's office overlooked a quiet side street where people walked their dogs and stopped for coffee. It felt impossible that my whole life had changed less than 24 hours earlier. He greeted me with a handshake. You look exhausted. I feel worse than I look. He smiled sympathetically. That part will pass. I wasn't so sure. Once we were seated, he opened a thick file that was much larger than the one he'd given me the day before. This, he said, tapping the folder, is why your grandmother asked me to meet with you again. He slid several documents across the desk. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Deeds, property records, transfer documents. Everything had been notarized and recorded months before Grandma passed away. I looked up. She transferred the Denver house. Michael nodded. 6 months ago. But why wouldn't she tell me? She wanted to. He leaned back in his chair. She changed her mind after something happened. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened? Michael took a slow breath before answering. Brian came here last fall. That surprised me. He told me he had business in Aspen. He did. Michael folded his hands. But he also met with your grandmother. I stared at him. For what? To ask for money. The words hung in the room. He said he had an investment opportunity, Michael continued. He claimed it was temporary, and that you didn't need to know because he planned to repay her quickly. I shook my head. He never told me any of this. I didn't expect he would. Michael reached into the file again and removed a legal pad covered in Grandma Margaret's neat handwriting. She asked me to document everything after that meeting. I read the first page. Brian had requested nearly $1 million. He'd promised extraordinary returns through a commercial real estate partnership. Grandma hadn't believed him. Instead of writing a check, she'd hired a private investigator. I looked at Michael. She actually investigated my husband. She did, and he slid another report toward me. The investigator found far more than anyone expected. Brian wasn't simply chasing risky investments. He had accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal debt. There were unpaid credit lines, private loans, a gambling habit that had never appeared on our joint accounts because he'd opened new ones in his own name. I covered my mouth. No, Michael quietly continued. There was no evidence he was having an affair. In many ways, the financial deception was even more extensive. Everything suddenly made sense. The pressure to sell the house, the rushed divorce, the confidence. He wasn't starting a new life. He was trying to escape an old one. Michael handed me the sealed letter Grandma had written. I think you're ready now. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was only one handwritten page. Claire, if you're reading this, then Brian has shown you exactly who he is. Don't waste your energy trying to convince dishonest people to become honest. Let the truth do that work for you. I know this will hurt. I also know you'll survive it. Love, Grandma. By the time I reached the last line, my eyes were blurred with tears. Michael waited until I folded the letter before speaking again. There's one more thing. I looked up. The sale Brian completed yesterday. He paused. If everything happened exactly as you've described, there's a very good chance he committed real estate fraud. The room fell silent. For the first time since Brian handed me those divorce papers, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was wondering how much trouble he had already created for himself. For the next week, I lived in a strange limbo. By day, I went to work like nothing had happened. I reviewed compliance reports, attended Zoom meetings, and smiled politely when coworkers asked how my trip to Aspen had gone. By night, I sat at Linda's kitchen table with stacks of legal documents spread in front of me. I still hadn't signed the divorce papers. Neither had I told Brian what Michael had discovered. That wasn't a game. It was Michael's advice. Let the facts surface on their own, he'd said. The truth has a way of finding daylight. As much as I wanted to confront Brian, I forced myself to stay quiet. It wasn't easy. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected another message from Patricia. Instead, I found something even more revealing. Brian had started posting again. For months, he barely used Facebook. Now suddenly there were pictures, a brand new black Tesla Model X, a caption that read "New Beginnings." The comments poured in. Congratulations. Good for you. Looks like business is booming. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The down payment alone must have been enormous. He wasn't acting like a man who had just filed for divorce. He was acting like someone who believed he'd won the lottery. Linda walked into the kitchen carrying 2 bowls of chili. She glanced at my phone. That your husband? Unfortunately, she looked at the picture. Nice car. It isn't paid for. You know that I know Brian. She set my bowl in front of me. People who suddenly get rich usually slow down. She nodded toward the phone. People pretending to be rich speed up. That turned out to be exactly what Brian did. Within days, he bought a Rolex, joined an expensive golf club in Highlands Ranch, put money down on a luxury condo in Scottsdale, Arizona. Even Patricia seemed to be enjoying herself. A mutual friend accidentally sent me screenshots from Patricia's social media. She'd posted photos from the Capitol Grill in downtown Denver. Designer shopping bags sat beside her chair. Champagne glasses filled the table. One caption read, "Sometimes life rewards the people who deserve it." Linda rolled her eyes. She's really tempting fate. I wished that were the end of it. But my own problems were growing. Michael warned me not to expect a quick resolution. The title company had discovered irregularities, but investigations moved slowly. Meanwhile, I still needed somewhere to live. My clothes were in storage. I was paying attorney's fees. The mortgage payments had become a confusing legal issue. While ownership was being reviewed, every bill reminded me that justice wasn't free. One afternoon, after another meeting with Michael, I sat alone in my car outside Washington Park. For the first time, I questioned everything. What if this drags on for years? I whispered. What if I lose anyway? 7 million sounded like security. It didn't feel like security. It felt trapped behind paperwork, court filings, and waiting. Grandma had protected me, but she couldn't protect me from exhaustion. A few days later, Michael finally called with real news. The title company has contacted the buyer. I gripped the steering wheel. What happened? They found a serious ownership problem. I closed my eyes, and they're asking questions Brian can't answer. Before I could respond, Michael added one more sentence. Claire, the buyer isn't blaming you. He isn't. No. There was a pause. He's very interested in meeting the man who sold him a house he didn't legally own. For the first time in days, I laughed. Not because Brian was in trouble, because the truth had finally started catching up with him. The man who bought our house called Michael before he called anyone else. That alone surprised me. I'd expected an angry homeowner demanding answers. Instead, Michael told me the buyer had been calm, professional, and more confused than furious. His name is David Reynolds, Michael said over the phone,